Hi, we have been going through this Lent reading plan at Mill Hill East Church, and what we're thinking of doing as a team is we're thinking that it'd be really good as we come into the final 2 weeks to pick up this reading plan together. The last 2 weeks leading right up to Easter Sunday, we are going to be going through the Gospel of Luke. So what we're going to do is each day one of us is going to sit down and basically go through the day's passage, maybe give some initial thoughts that might help you in your reading and your study, and then we'll try and arrange some group discussion, either in our small groups, over Zoom, maybe just in some of our conversations with each other. And hopefully, we'll see what God says to us through it. So we are starting today in Luke 1. Pretty profound, beautiful opening to the gospel. For these Bible studies, I'd encourage you, the kind of simplest but most helpful method for studying the Bible is often called the inductive Bible method. And you basically ask 3 questions. What does it say? What does it mean? And what shall I do? So first of all, what does it say? It's a really, really beautiful passage. Starts with a short introduction about who to and why the book was written, what its purpose is. Then we have prediction of the birth of John the Baptist, prediction of the birth of Jesus. We have then the 2 mothers, Mary and Elizabeth, Jesus' and John's mother. They have these encounters, they meet with angels, they speak with God, and there's these 2 beautiful songs right in the towards the tail end of this chapter. The Magnificat, Mary's song, and then we have Zechariah's song, which has some of the most beautiful verses. I love this bit at the end. It's probably one of my favourite bits. You, my child, this is talking about John the Baptist, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. Oh, stunning, absolutely stunning. What does it mean? Well, it was really common in the time that this was written. You got to remember that this was before books were invented. Some Christians were some of the first people to use basically bound books like we have with a spine, which was often called a codex. But lots of writings were scrolls. So it was common convention for the opening kind of verses of whatever book you wrote to act as almost like the cover or the spine of a book. And it would say who wrote it, who they wrote it to, the purpose, the significance of the writing, and it would have all those things. And we have some of those elements here in Luke. We doesn't quite spell out who the author is. Lots of people, historically, kind of looking at the details of it all, say that it was Luke the doctor, one of the early disciples of Jesus. He also wrote Acts, so Luke, Acts are kind of together, and in Acts he starts to talk in the first person at different sections in the narrative, but he isn't named here. And he writes about creating this orderly account, basically to encourage people in faith. He writes about there being other writings, possibly other gospels, other accounts of Jesus, but we get this sense that this is going to be an eyewitness account, ordered. He writes about an orderly account. Now that doesn't just mean chronological, that means put together in order to help you make sense. So straight away we get this sense that where things are in this gospel is going to be important. It's going to affect the meaning and how we understand things. And then the title is Most Excellent Theophilus. Now you might have heard a few different things about this. Who was this Theophilus character? Some have said, because Theophilus just means lover of God, that this was a kind of, could be anyone who was a disciple, anyone who loved God. That's probably not very likely. Theophilus was a very common name, and the fact that he's called Most Excellent Theophilus, you wouldn't necessarily put that kind of title, Most Excellent, before a kind of made up constructs like that. That's a bit of a clunky thing to do in the first, second century, around when this was written. Um, Most excellent as a title, often people have flagged up that can mean someone in politics or in law courts. So some have said, is this a legal case that's being presented? Again, that's adding a lot in. It's interesting to think about what is the purpose of this. But one thing that we do know is that even though this is addressed to one person, books weren't written in the same way as they are now. This isn't a letter to an individual person. Luke clearly expected this to be read by a wider audience. So even though it's addressed to this person and given this purpose, and of course there's an incredible purpose, this is going to be an amazing faith-giving thing to read this gospel, he is expecting that purpose is wider than just the first person who read it. Letters were written to be read in groups and discussed and shared and passed on, and that comes through. And then we have this incredible story of these women who give birth to these. To first of all, John. The term often used of him is the harbinger. He is the one who makes the way for Jesus, and Jesus himself. And there's lots of interesting detail in this that we can dig into and discuss. But I think one thing that I'd maybe like to pick up in terms of the meaning is that a lot of what occurs in these verses is paralleled with Abraham and Abraham's story. The way that Melchizedek comes to Abraham and his conversation is mirrored in some of Gabriel's conversations with Mary. Some of what the Lord says to Abraham, the Lord says to Elizabeth. There are loads and loads of parallels and allusions. The way that Mary presents herself as a servant is the same as Abraham's response. There isn't a clean kind of, Mary is Abraham in this story and this is this. All the characters kind of weave across, but a lot of these verses and these individual lines are actually direct quotes. In some points, the words are the exact same as the Greek version of the Old Testament that they would have been using. So there's clear parallels there. What does that mean? Well, there's a key thing in that we're going to pick up in the Gospel of Luke, and why Luke starts with Abraham, because through Abraham all nations will be blessed. And that's a really important point. Where some of the other Gospels emphasise Moses or the prophets at the start and Jesus' fulfilment of them, Luke goes right back earlier in the story to Abraham, because the promise to Abraham explicitly was one of inclusion, was one of everyone being welcome. And that's going to be a real key theme throughout the Gospel of Luke. And it's a real key theme, even just on a surface reading in these verses, that God comes to the unknown. God comes to small, lowly, forgotten. And they don't respond, wow, I am blessed. They respond by retelling the Bible story. You've been faithful to your people. It's a really interesting response, that God would come and bless and call someone and they would respond, haven't you remembered your nation? Haven't you remembered your people? It's a really, really beautiful response. In terms of how we apply it, I guess there's a really obvious application there. Where do we start telling our story from? I've been thinking about this a lot with a lot of the crazy conspiracy theories going around at the moment about coronavirus and about Christians' reaction to coronavirus. And I'm going to speak about that a little bit more in the sermon at our live stream service this morning. But one thing that strikes me is you can only come up with some of these conspiracy theories if you just tell the story from where we are now. But if you tell a longer story of God's people throughout history, what we're facing now isn't on the scale as what God's people have been through before. It's serious, it's dramatic, but it's no way near the scale of some of the plagues or what was called the Spanish flu, some of these things that millions of people lost their lives. The world wars, we're not facing a loss of life on that scale as tragic as the consequences of what we are facing might be. So I think that's the application. Where do we start telling our story from? And how does it include other people? So yeah, I hope you get a lot out of this chapter. If you weren't planning to follow the Bible reading, or if you haven't been following it up to now, I'd urge you to do it. Read Luke 1 today. Join in with us this 2-week adventure leading right up to Easter Sunday, and we'll see what God says to us.